Gary stood by the bar, watching Brenda laugh with another man, her hand lingering on his arm just a beat too long. The cold beer in his hand tasted like ash as he felt 100 eyes on his back, knowing they saw what he saw. When she finally met his gaze, her smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of something he didn't recognize. "He's just an old friend, Gary," she said. The Chicago summer heat still clung to Gary like a burr when he stepped into his modest 2-bedroom apartment. He peeled his damp shirt from his skin, tossing it over the back of the kitchen chair before heading into the living room. The air inside felt thick, stagnant, and the unusual silence immediately raised a flag. Usually, he'd hear the television humming low, or the soft clink of dishes from the kitchen. But today, only the distant drone of city traffic filtered through the closed windows. He found Brenda perched stiffly on the worn leather couch, her hands clasped in front of her. She wasn't watching anything, just staring at a spot on the opposite wall, her gaze distant. Her hair, usually swept back neatly, had a few strands escaping, framing her face in a way that made her seem smaller. Gary leaned in for his usual greeting, a quick kiss on the temple. But she turned her head just as his lips reached her, making them graze her cheek instead. A cold shiver, unexpected and sharp, ran down his spine. The scent of her perfume, familiar and comforting, now felt alien in the air between them. "Brenda?" he asked, his voice low, a question more than a greeting. She took a slow, deliberate breath. Her voice, when it came, was steady. Too steady. "We need to talk, Gary." Her eyes remained fixed on the wall, avoiding his. The words hung in the air, heavy and solid, like a stone dropped into still water. Gary's mind raced, 100 possibilities flashing and fading. Brenda was a steady woman, practical, not one for dramatics or sudden declarations. This was serious. He knew it in the way the blood felt cold in his veins, in the sudden tightness in his chest. He watched her take another deep breath, her chest rising and falling slowly. Her fingers fidgeted, twisting the thin gold wedding band on her left hand, a small, continuous motion that spoke volumes. Finally, she lifted her gaze, meeting his with an unsettling calm. Her eyes, usually warm, held a cool, distant look he hadn't seen before. "I've been doing a lot of thinking, Gary," she began, her voice even. "About us. About life. I think we should try an open marriage." Gary felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. The words didn't register right. They were sounds, but they formed no coherent meaning in his brain. "An open what?" he asked, his voice rough, disbelieving. He thought he must have misheard. Perhaps the hum of the old refrigerator or a distant siren had distorted her words. Brenda repeated it, firmer this time, her resolve hardening with each syllable. "An open marriage. Just for a couple of weeks, to see how it feels." A hot flush spread through Gary's body, replacing the earlier chill. Anger, quick and sudden, flared within him. "Have you lost your mind, Brenda?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Are you actually saying you want us to sleep with other people?" The idea was so absurd, so foreign to their 10 years together, it felt like a sick joke. He saw their life, their shared history, their quiet routines, crumbling around him. She didn't flinch. "It's about exploration, Gary. About rediscovering ourselves, maybe even rediscovering each other. People change. We're not the same people we were when we got married." Her tone was almost clinical, like she was discussing a household chore rather than the foundation of their entire life. "I'm happy with our life," Gary yelled, the words torn from his throat. "I'm happy with you. What is there to rediscover? I like what we have." His hands clenched into fists, the knuckles white. He paced a small circle in front of her, the worn rug soft beneath his sneakers. Every fiber of his being rebelled against the notion. Their apartment, their quiet comfort, the shared silence. It was all suddenly tainted. Fragile. They argued for hours. The initial shock gave way to a dull ache in Gary's temples. Brenda remained unnervingly calm, her arguments revolving around personal growth, outdated monogamy, and new experiences. She talked about freedom, about self-actualization, terms Gary usually associated with magazine articles, not serious conversations about their marriage. He felt like he was debating a stranger, a woman who had meticulously prepared her points, while he was scrambling, trying to defend a life he thought was perfectly solid. "This isn't some experiment, Brenda," Gary finally said, his voice now low and strained, drained of its earlier fury. He stopped pacing, standing directly in front of her, his shadow falling across her face. He looked down at her, seeing her quiet defiance. "If you do this, Brenda, we're over." The words, once spoken, felt like breaking something irreplaceable. Brenda looked at Gary then, her eyes a complex mix of sadness and something that looked like quiet frustration. Her gaze held no anger, only a weary resolve. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Gary," she said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "But I think this is something I need to do for me. And for us. In the long run." The "for us" felt like a cruel irony. A twist of the knife. He watched her, a stranger in their own living room, detailing her escape plan with the precision of a travel agent. Gary spent the night on the couch. The worn cushions offered no comfort against the cold knot in his stomach. The city sounds outside a distant siren, the rumble of a late-night bus did little to distract from the noise inside his head. Anger surged, then confusion. Then a raw, aching heartbreak that made his chest feel hollow. He replayed their conversation, every word, every nuance. Had he missed something? A sign? A warning? He pressed his face into the fabric of the cushion, smelling the faint scent of stale beer and old dust, a far cry from Brenda's clean, floral perfume. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Every time he drifted, a fresh wave of questions pulled him back to the surface. He woke with the first gray light of dawn filtering through the blinds, a fleeting hope that it had all been a terrible dream. But then his eyes landed on it. A small, blue suitcase, packed and standing by the front door. The sight shattered the fragile illusion. Her denim jacket was draped over it, a familiar scarf poking out from under the flap. It was real. Brenda emerged from the bedroom a few minutes later, fully dressed, her expression carefully neutral. She walked past the couch without a glance, heading straight for the suitcase. "I'm going to stay with my sister for a while," she said, her voice low. As she picked up the bag, she still wouldn't meet his eyes, focusing instead on the latch of the suitcase, clicking it shut unnecessarily. "I need some space." To think, Gary watched her, his body heavy, his limbs unwilling to move. He saw her grab her purse, then her keys from the small bowl on the entryway table. The sound of the jingling metal cut through the silence. She paused at the door, her hand on the knob. She turned her head slightly, offering a brief, almost imperceptible nod. Then she was gone. The click of the lock echoed in the now truly empty apartment. A profound numbness settled over Gary. He sat on the couch, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity. The morning light grew brighter, painting stripes across the rug where Brenda's suitcase had stood. Then, the numbness gave way to a sudden, crushing weight. He slid from the couch to the floor, his head falling into his hands. The rough carpet fibers pressed against his skin, a small, insistent pain that was a welcome distraction from the vast emptiness inside him. The following days blurred into an exhausting cycle. He threw himself into work at the fabrication shop, staying late, taking on extra shifts. The roar of the machinery, the smell of cut metal, the precise demands of the blueprints, these were concrete things he could control, unlike his life at home. He dreaded the moment he had to leave. The drive through the Chicago traffic feeling like a slow march to an execution. Each turn brought him closer to the silent apartment, a place that had once been a refuge but now felt like a tomb. Colleagues noticed. "Everything all right, Gary?" Old Mike from machining would ask, his brow furrowed with concern. "You seem a little distant." Gary would offer a vague shrug, mumbling something about a rough week, a head cold. He couldn't articulate the horror, the quiet, personal catastrophe that had engulfed his world. How could he explain that his wife had walked out, not for another man, but for the idea of other men? A week passed. Each day felt heavier than the last, a leaden weight pressing down on him. The silence at home became deafening, amplifying every creak of the old building, every distant car horn. He missed the small sounds Brenda made, the rustle of her turning a page, the clink of her coffee cup, her quiet humming as she moved about the kitchen. Now, only absence remained. He felt the sharp, persistent sting of betrayal. It wasn't just that she left. It was the reason. The question gnawed at him, a relentless parasite. Had he failed her? Had he been so blind, so complacent, that he hadn't seen this coming? Where had they gone wrong? How could this be happening to them, to the life they had carefully built, brick by brick, over 10 years? He pictured their wedding day, the sun on her face as they stood under the arbor in her parents' backyard. Their voices steady as they exchanged vows, promises that now felt hollow, mocking echoes in his memory. The apartment, once filled with their shared history, now felt like a mausoleum. Every object was a reminder. Her favorite mug in the cupboard, the book she had left face down on the nightstand, the faint scent of her shampoo clinging to a towel in the bathroom. They were relics of a life that was suddenly gone. He often considered calling her, his thumb hovering over her contact in his phone. He imagined pleading with her, begging her to come back, to just talk, to fix whatever was broken. But pride, a stubborn, bitter thing, held him back, and beneath the pride, a deeper, more chilling fear. The fear of her answer, of what she might say, of what she might have already done in the silence of her exploration. The fluorescent hum of the fabrication shop finally faded into the low din of a neighborhood bar. Gary sat on a worn stool, nursing his third whiskey, the amber liquid doing little to silence the echo of Brenda's words in his head. Open marriage, exploration, personal growth. Each phrase was a fresh sting. He traced the condensation on his glass, the cold dampness a small anchor in the swirling chaos of his thoughts, the cheap wood paneling, the smell of stale beer and fried food, the muffled laughter from a group at the back. It was all a blur, a backdrop to his private torment. A woman's voice cut through his haze. "Is this seat taken?" Gary looked up. She was attractive, with long dark hair that fell past her shoulders, and eyes that held a certain mischievous sparkle. Under different circumstances, he might have felt a flicker of interest, a pull of curiosity. Tonight, he felt only a dull ache in his chest, a heavy indifference. He gestured to the empty stool beside him, the one Brenda usually occupied. "No," he said, his voice a bit rougher than he intended. "It's all yours," she smiled, a quick, confident flash of white teeth. "Thanks." She slid onto the stool, her movements fluid and easy, and signaled the bartender. "Martini, please. Extra olive." "Loretta," she offered, extending a hand across the sticky bar top. "Gary," he replied, shaking her hand briefly. Her grip was firm, her skin warm. He pulled his hand back, retreating to the safety of his drink, his gaze fixed on the ice cubes, swirling in the whiskey. Loretta, however, was undeterred. She chatted easily, her voice a pleasant, low murmur. She asked about his job, about what brought him to this particular bar on a Tuesday night. Gary found himself responding, despite his initial reluctance. It felt surprisingly good to talk to someone who didn't know the mess he was in, someone who wasn't looking at him with pity or concern. He offered vague answers about steel and long hours, omitting the silent, empty apartment that awaited him. As the night wore on, and the whiskeys turned into 4, then 5, he started to relax. Loretta was funny, her stories about her work in real estate peppered with dry wit. She laughed easily, a light tinkling sound that seemed to chase away some of the oppressive silence that had followed him for days. For the first time since Brenda walked out, the persistent, crushing weight on his chest lightened, if only by a fraction. The bar became a small, temporary haven, a bubble where the outside world, and Brenda, couldn't reach him. The clock on the wall above the bar showed past midnight when Loretta leaned in close, her breath warm against his ear, smelling faintly of gin and olives. "Want to get out of here?" she whispered, her eyes meeting his. A clear invitation in their depths. Gary felt a jolt. This was it. This was the exploration, the excitement Brenda had spoken of, offered on a platter, wrapped in dark hair and a knowing smile. He could do it. He could walk out of here with Loretta, go back to her place, or even his own, and not look back. He could show Brenda that he could play her game, too. He could find his own personal growth, his own new experiences, The thought flashed through his mind, quick and tempting, a defiant act against the betrayal that still burned within him. It would be a way to strike back, a way to numb the pain with something new, something reckless. But then, as quickly as the thought came, it vanished. A cold certainty settled over him, pushing out the anger and the fleeting temptation. He couldn't do it. No matter how much anger churned in his gut, no matter how deep the hurt, he couldn't. His marriage vows, even if Brenda had seemingly discarded hers, were still real to him. They were a foundation, not just words. He looked at Loretta, her expectant smile, and a wave of nausea washed over him. He knew, with a clarity that surprised him, that if he walked out with her, he wouldn't be proving anything to Brenda. He'd only be betraying himself, and the man he believed he was. "I'm sorry," Gary said abruptly, pushing himself off the stool. The movement felt clumsy, uncoordinated. The whiskey had numbed him, but the sudden decision had brought a sharp clarity. "I can't. I'm married." The words felt heavy, solid, like anchors. He looked at Loretta, her smile faltering, her eyes losing their sparkle. Her face fell for a moment, a brief flicker of disappointment, quickly masked. She composed herself with a practiced ease, a small, sad smile replacing her earlier invitation. "Lucky woman," she said, her voice softer now, tinged with a quiet understanding. She didn't press, didn't argue. She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the boundary he had just drawn. Gary didn't wait for another word. He turned and walked out of the bar, the cold night air hitting his face like a slap. He was in a daze, his mind reeling from what he had just turned down, from the choice he had just made. He had rejected exactly what Brenda suggested they both do. He had stood firm, held the line, upheld the vow. Instead of feeling virtuous, instead of a surge of moral triumph, he felt hollow, empty. The anger that had fueled him for days had temporarily dissipated, replaced by a vast, aching void. The walk home was a blur of streetlights and passing cars. His apartment, when he finally reached it, felt colder, darker than ever. He kicked off his shoes and walked into the living room, the familiar space now imbued with a different kind of silence. He sat on the edge of the couch, the same couch where he'd spent the night after Brenda left, the same couch where they'd argued. He stared at the blank television screen, seeing nothing, feeling everything, and then something broke inside him. He hadn't cried in years, not since his father died, and even then, it had been a contained, quiet grief. But now, it wasn't contained. Great. Heaving sobs ripped through him, shaking his entire body. He bent over, burying his face in his hands, the tears hot and relentless, streaming between his fingers. He cried for the marriage he thought he had, for the comfortable, predictable future he'd imagined for them both. He cried for the trust that had been shattered in a single, calm conversation, for the easy companionship that now felt like a relic from another lifetime. He cried for Brenda, for the woman he loved, even as she caused him this unimaginable pain. Curled up on the couch, tears soaking the worn fabric, a realization slowly dawned on him, cutting through the fog of grief and anger. He had a choice. He could let this destroy him, let it destroy them, let it tear down everything they had built. Or he could fight. The thought of losing Brenda forever, truly losing her, cut deeper than any anger or betrayal he felt. It was a cold, sharp pain that eclipsed everything else. He remembered their first date, a nervous evening at a diner, how her laughter had bubbled up, bright and genuine, when he spilled his coffee. He remembered their quiet moments, holding hands on long drives, the comfortable silence of reading side by side on Sunday mornings, the way she hummed when she cooked. These weren't grand gestures. They were the small, sturdy planks of their life together. He understood, with a profound and aching clarity, that he still loved her. Despite the pain, despite the confusion, despite the feeling of being discarded, the love was still there. A deep, persistent current beneath the surface. This wasn't just about him, or his hurt, or his wounded pride. It was about them. It was about what they had built, what they still had the potential to be. It was about fighting for the woman he had promised to cherish, even when she was pushing him away. He couldn't give up. Not yet. The next morning, the alarm blared. but Gary didn't reach for his work clothes. Instead, he called in sick. His voice a little hoarse, but steady. Feeling a bit under the weather, he mumbled into the phone, ignoring the slight pang of guilt. His mind was elsewhere, focused with a renewed purpose he hadn't felt in days. The decision from the night before, made in tears and anguish, now solidified into a cold clarity. He was going to fight. He spent the morning hunched over his laptop, making phone calls. The internet offered countless therapists, each website a dizzying array of specialties and philosophies. He focused on marriage counseling, searching for someone who could see them quickly. After 3 calls, he found Dr. Eris, a woman with a calm, reassuring voice who could squeeze them in for an initial consultation on Friday afternoon. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. He booked it, a small surge of hope battling against the persistent dread. Next, he thought about their history, about what they had once shared. He pulled out an old photo album, flipping through the pages until he found the pictures from their honeymoon. The little bed and breakfast, the Willow Creek Inn, nestled by a quiet lake, just a few hours' drive from Chicago. It was a place of uncomplicated happiness, a memory untainted by their current mess. With a trembling hand, he called and, to his surprise, managed to book their old room for the upcoming weekend. The deposit felt like a heavy investment, a wager on a future that was far from certain. With the appointments made, the plans laid, his heart felt like it was lodged in his throat. He stared at his phone, Brenda's contact glowing on the screen. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to calm the frantic beating in his chest, then pressed call. Each ring was an eternity, a tiny hammer striking against his eardrums. Hello? Brenda's voice was cautious, distant. But it was her. Brenda, it's Gary, he said, his voice surprisingly even. He had rehearsed this. We need to talk. Really talk. No accusations, no ultimatums, just us being honest. He focused on keeping his tone neutral, open, no hint of the anger or hurt that still simmered beneath the surface. He needed her to hear his sincerity. I've made some arrangements, he continued, before she could respond. I found a marriage counselor, Dr. Eris, for Friday afternoon, and I booked us a weekend at Willow Creek, our old room. We don't have to stay the whole weekend if you don't want to, but I thought maybe it would be a place where we could talk. He left a beat of silence, letting the words hang in the air, weighted with their unspoken history. Will you meet me? Just to talk. A long pause stretched on the other end of the line, a chasm of uncertainty. Gary could hear the faint hum of her sister's house in the background, a television, perhaps. He imagined her face, her thoughtful frown. He clenched his jaw. Waiting. This was the moment. This was where she either shut him down completely or gave them a chance. Okay, Brenda finally said, her voice soft, hesitant. The single word was a lifeline. Where? A wave of relief, so potent it almost buckled his knees, washed over him, quickly followed by a fresh surge of dread. There's a small coffee shop downtown. The Daily Grind. On State Street, he suggested. Neutral territory. Tomorrow, after work. Say, 5:30? 5:30, she confirmed. I'll be there. He hung up, the phone feeling heavy in his hand. Hope and dread swirled within him, a potent, unsettling cocktail. He had done all he could do for now. He had initiated. The ball was in motion. He spent the rest of the day in a strange limbo, preparing for the conversation. He mentally rehearsed what he would say, what he wouldn't. He had to listen. Truly listen. Without immediately reacting. This wasn't about winning an argument or proving he was right. It was about mending a life that felt like it had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. He felt a fragile sense of determination, a flicker of the old Gary, the one who tackled problems head-on. Returning, the thought of seeing Brenda again, really seeing her across a small table in a coffee shop, filled him with a profound longing. He missed her, the simple presence of her, more than he had allowed himself to admit. He needed to understand what had driven her away, what had made her consider such a drastic, painful solution. He needed to fight for the woman he had vowed to love. The road ahead was unclear, filled with landmines of unresolved emotion, but he knew he had to take the first step. Stick around to the end, to see how life's costly choices unfold. Gary arrived at the daily grind 15 minutes early. The small coffee shop was bustling, the air thick with the smell of espresso and the low hum of conversation. He ordered a black coffee, mostly for something to hold, and found a small table in the corner by the window, a place where they could talk without being too exposed. He scanned the faces of the patrons, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. Then he saw her. She was already there, tucked into a booth near the back, facing the door. Her profile was to him, her head slightly bowed. She looked tired, her usually neat auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, a few strands escaping around her face. She wore a simple gray sweater, and the faint lines of fatigue beneath her eyes were more pronounced than he remembered. Even so, even with the weight of everything between them, she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. A familiar ache, sharp and persistent, settled in his chest. He walked over, his steps feeling heavy, deliberate. "Hi," Gary said, his voice a little softer than he intended, as he slid into the seat across from her. The small table felt like a vast expanse between them. Brenda looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying recently, or hadn't slept. She offered a small, hesitant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi," she replied, her voice a low murmur. "Thanks for calling." She had a half-empty mug in front of her, steam still rising from the surface, though the coffee looked untouched. They sat in an awkward silence for a moment, the air heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of a week apart, and a lifetime of shared history. The clatter of coffee cups and the low chatter of other patrons filled the void, providing a strangely comforting buffer. Gary watched her, taking in the small details. He noticed the tension in Brenda's shoulders, the slight curve of her back as she hunched over the table. Her fingers picked at a loose thread on the cuff of her gray sweater, a nervous habit he remembered well. Her gaze drifted around the coffee shop, avoiding his. He took a deep breath, the scent of roasted coffee beans a stark contrast to the bitter, metallic taste in his own mouth. This was it, the difficult conversation. He needed to be calm, to listen. He consciously avoided looking at her left hand, not wanting to see if the wedding ring was still there, not wanting to reopen that raw wound just yet. He focused instead on the patterns the condensation made on his own cold coffee cup. His mind flashed back, unbidden, to their first date here. So many years ago. They had laughed easily then, talked for hours about nothing and everything. He remembered the feeling of lightness, of possibility, the electric charge of two people just discovering each other. This meeting felt like a lifetime away from that memory, separated by a chasm of hurt and uncertainty. He wondered if she'd had regrets in her time away, if she'd missed him, if the quiet solitude of her sister's house had brought any clarity, any understanding of the damage she had caused. He longed to know what was behind those red-rimmed eyes, what thoughts churned in her mind. He was about to speak, to push past the silence, to ask the first question, but the words caught in his throat, a sudden tightness constricting his voice. The fight he had prepared for felt suddenly overwhelming, precarious. The words were stuck, a lump in Gary's throat. He wanted to start a big conversation, to dissect their problems, but the pain and the longing were too raw. He swallowed hard, pushing past the blockage, and the simplest, most honest truth escaped him. "I miss you," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, almost lost in the coffee shop's ambient noise. Brenda's eyes, already red-rimmed, immediately welled up with fresh tears, reflecting the fluorescent lights. A tear tracked a path down her cheek. "I miss you too," she replied, her voice thick with emotion, cracking slightly. She didn't try to stop the tears, just let them fall. "God, Gary," she continued, looking directly at him now, her expression a mix of shame and exhaustion. "I've made such a mess of things." And then, like a dam breaking, everything poured out of Brenda. She spoke rapidly, a torrent of confessions, her words tumbling over each other. She talked about her fears, her deep-seated insecurities, the gnawing feeling that she was losing herself, fading into the background of their comfortable, predictable life. She described the suffocating pressure she felt, a self-imposed burden to be the perfect wife, the perfect professional at her advertising job, the perfect everything. She felt unseen, unheard, a supporting character in her own story. "I thought if we opened our marriage," she admitted, wiping away tears with the back of her hand, her voice raw, "it would force us to appreciate each other more. To fight for each other, you know, to really see what we had." She took a shaky breath, her chest rising and falling. "But I realize now how stupid that was, how incredibly reckless." Her gaze dropped to the table, her fingers still picking at the thread on her sleeve. "I was so focused on what I thought we were missing," she confessed, her voice barely audible, "on this vague idea of more, that I almost threw everything away. Everything that actually mattered." She finally looked up at him, her eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. Gary reached across the table, his hand finding hers. Her skin was cool, trembling slightly. He squeezed gently, his heart aching for her pain, for the hidden struggle she had carried in silence. He hadn't seen it, hadn't known. He felt a profound regret, a sharp awareness of his own blindness. "Why didn't you tell me you were feeling this way?" he asked softly, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, insistent need to understand. Brenda shrugged, her gaze still fixed on their intertwined fingers, as if finding solace in the connection. "I didn't know how, Gary. We've always been so solid, you know? The quiet ones. We didn't do big arguments, or big talks about feelings. I didn't want to rock the boat." The irony of her words hung in the air, thick and undeniable. Gary let out a soft, mirthless laugh, a sound that held no humor, only a bitter acknowledgement of their shared failure to communicate. "Well," he said, "I'd say the boat has been pretty thoroughly rocked now, wouldn't you?" Brenda managed a small, watery smile through her tears, a genuine flicker of humor touching her eyes for the first time. "Yeah," she whispered, her voice still hoarse. "I guess it has." A profound sense of relief washed over Gary. The honesty, finally spoken aloud, felt like fresh air after being suffocated for weeks. It wasn't easy, it wasn't comfortable, but it was real. It felt like a foundation, cracked and damaged, but still present, something tangible they could perhaps build on. The truth, however painful, was a start. They talked for hours in the bustling coffee shop, the noise of the afternoon fading into the quieter hum of early evening. It was a true conversation, a raw unpacking of years of unspoken feelings, unlike any they had shared in their decade together. They moved from Brenda's confessions to Gary's own hidden resentments and fears. Gary took a deep breath, the moment finally feeling right to share his part. He told her about the bar, about Loretta, about the drink, and the easy conversation. He didn't spare himself, detailing how close he came to doing exactly what she'd suggested, walking out with another woman, a desperate act of rebellion and pain. He watched her face as he spoke, seeing the sharp, visceral pain in her eyes, a wince of recognition for the depth of his hurt. But beneath the pain, he also saw something else. A flicker of relief. Relief that he hadn't. Relief that he had chosen their marriage, however fractured, over a fleeting, retaliatory thrill. They discussed the pain, the anger that had festered in Gary's gut, the profound sense of betrayal, the trust that had been shattered so casually. There were no quick fixes, no easy answers. The wounds were fresh, still bleeding. Brenda, in turn, apologized, her voice still a little shaky, for her thoughtlessness, for not communicating her feelings sooner, for blindsiding him with such a radical proposition. Her admission that she had acted out of desperation, not malice, didn't erase the hurt, but it helped Gary understand it. Gary, in turn, acknowledged his own shortcomings, his occasional neglect, the way he sometimes retreated into himself after a long day at the shop, his inability to see past his own comfortable routine, to notice the subtle signs of her struggles, her growing unease. He admitted he had perhaps become complacent, taking their solidity for granted, not realizing that even the strongest foundations needed regular maintenance. They explored the root of her insecurities, his fears, and how they both, in their own quiet ways, had contributed to the growing distance between them. It was a difficult, messy conversation, punctuated by silences and renewed tears. But it was also profoundly cathartic. Each spoken word, each shared vulnerability, chipped away at the wall that had formed between them. The coffee in their mugs had long gone cold. The daylight outside had faded into dusk, and the coffee shop was almost empty now. As the sun began to set outside, casting long, bruised purple shadows across their table, Gary squeezed Brenda's hand again, his thumb brushing against her wedding ring, a small, tangible presence he now noticed. He looked into her eyes, seeing not just the lingering sadness, but a glimmer of something familiar, something he recognized. "Hope. I can't promise it will be easy," he said, his voice low, firm, his gaze holding hers. "It's going to be hard work. A lot of hard work." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "But I want to try to fix this, to make us stronger, not just go back to how we were. To really build something new." He held his breath, the question hanging in the air. "If you're willing." Brenda nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Her lips trembled slightly, but her eyes held a new resolve. "I'm willing, Gary," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I want to try." The weight of weeks of despair, of loneliness, of suffocating uncertainty, began to lift from Gary's shoulders. Not entirely, but enough to breathe a little easier. He knew this was just the first step, a fragile agreement made in a quiet coffee shop. But it was a crucial one. It was a step back from the edge, a hesitant movement towards a shared future. Uncertain, but now, finally, possible. The quiet "I'm willing" from Brenda was quickly followed by a slow, spreading smile. It was a smile that transformed her tired, tear-stained face, a gradual brightening that felt like the sun finally breaking through storm clouds after a long, oppressive week. Her eyes, still a little red, now held a sparkle he hadn't seen in ages. A familiar light that promised possibility. "Yes," she said again, her voice firmer this time, full of renewed hope and a quiet, steadfast determination. "Yes, Gary. I'm willing. I truly am." They sat there for a few more moments, hands still clasped across the cool table, absorbing the silence that had settled between them. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence from earlier, nor the empty, echoing silence of his apartment. This was a different kind of quiet, not a void, but a space filled with the fragile promise of healing, of a future that might still be salvageable. It felt like holding a delicate bird in his hands, aware of its small, precious heartbeat. Gary then laid out the details. Dr. Eris, the marriage counselor, for their session on Friday afternoon. And the Willow Creek Inn, their old room, for the weekend. He spoke calmly, methodically, watching her reaction. Brenda listened intently, her head nodding slightly with each detail. Her eagerness was palpable, a quiet energy radiating from her. "Yes, that sounds good," she said, a small catch in her voice. "All of it. Thank you, Gary, for not giving up." The confession hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of his fight, of his painful stand. He squeezed her hand again. "Let's go home, Brenda," he said, his voice husky, not to his empty house, or to her sister's. To their house. She didn't hesitate. She gathered her purse, and they walked out of the daily grind, leaving the ghosts of their past arguments and their fragile new beginnings behind them. The evening light was soft, painting the Chicago streets in hues of orange and purple. The air was cooler now, a gentle breeze rustling through the leaves on the trees. The path forward was still unclear. Gary knew. It was undoubtedly filled with challenges, with difficult conversations they would have to revisit, with trust that would need to be painstakingly rebuilt, brick by painful brick. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, perhaps even anger resurfacing. But as they walked, side by side, he felt a cautious optimism bloom in his chest, a fragile belief that their love, though tested to its very core, could endure. As they stepped onto the busy sidewalk, Gary moved closer and gently put his arm around Brenda's waist. It was a simple, familiar gesture, one they hadn't shared in weeks, and she responded instinctively, leaning into him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. The warmth of her body, the familiar scent of her hair, felt like coming home. The journey to mend their fractured trust, to reforge the bonds that had been so carelessly frayed, would be long. It would demand patience, forgiveness, and an honesty they hadn't quite mastered before. But for the very first time since Brenda's shocking proposal, since the agonizing days of her absence, Gary felt a genuine hope for their future. It wasn't a grand, soaring hope, but a quiet, Midwestern kind of promise. Unspoken, deeply felt, and built on the hard, necessary work of choosing to forgive and choosing to try again. The quiet understanding in Brenda's face, the slight tilt of her head against his shoulder, offered no grand pronouncements. It was merely a shared acknowledgement of a steep climb ahead. Gary understood that the anger and the pain wouldn't vanish overnight. The wounds were fresh, the scars yet to form. They would face Dr. Eris. They would revisit the familiar walls of the Willow Creek Inn, and they would continue to talk, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes painfully. Their commitment wasn't born of a sudden romantic resurgence, but from the hard, undeniable truth that they still chose each other. It was a Midwestern kind of resilience, a quiet acceptance that life and love often demanded persistent effort. The evening faded into night as they walked, their footsteps in sync, heading towards a house that was now, once again, theirs. They carried their broken pieces, not in celebration, but in the sober resolve to try and make them whole. The future remained unwritten. But for now, they were writing it together.